all speakers consent. First and last minute protected. At the time it reaches 7 minutes and 15 seconds, you should have stopped speaking because I will have stopped listening. I won't type timings in the chat. If one of the panelists has an urge to do so, then feel free, but these are all big. You should be able to time yourselves. Cool. I would like to invite people to please indicate their preferred method of receiving a POI at the start of our speech. If speakers do not do so, please default to offering POIs through the chat. As is customary, you are all encouraged to take them. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to deliver a speech not exceeding 7 minutes and 15 seconds in length. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I clearly visible and audible?
You are both of those things.
Oh, awesome. POIs in the chat, please, and I will take one when I can. Anyway, starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Couple of housekeeping matters. First, what does expedition mean? I think it means a couple of things. As a bloc, it means I think getting rid of bureaucratic red tape, holding at the process that allows for Ukraine to get NATO membership. It also means convincing allies to vote for this measure in the coming weeks, holding an extraordinary summit to get it done because they didn't get it done in the previous summit in June. But also it means starting military integration early with Ukraine ASAP, which also includes joint military exercises, like integrating intelligence networks and gathering, which means that the Ukraine is better protected insofar as there's more intelligence going into the nation, there's more military aid coming into it in the coming weeks. Note also, as part of my housekeeping issues, framing that this kind of aggression by Russia that is currently happening is unlikely to be ceasing on their side of the house on all. The reason for this is that Putin views the Ukraine as an eastern buffer against the West and therefore wants to control it in its entirety. This view exists irrespective of whether membership is approved or not. Case in point, the aggression that the Ukraine is experiencing is happening today, even though they're not currently a NATO member right now. So as a result, I think the problem here, therefore, is that right now, and on both sides of the house, it is quite likely that Russia has a view towards invading Ukraine, or at the very least, committing to military incursions in the Ukraine on both sides of the house. Given this, I think the protection of the Ukraine is crucial for a couple of reasons. The first is the urgency of the situation. Russia is literally, at this point of time, already amassing troops on the border. That is to say that there are literal Russian military exercises happening on the border with the Ukraine as we speak. This also is exacerbated by the fact that they also have a history of having incursions eastward. So, for instance, Western Odysseus, Crimea, Georgia, or for instance, the insurgency in eastern Ukraine that was supported by Russia. All of this means there is a precedence that Russia is likely to do this in the near future. The second thing that's important to note is that President Zelensky is anti-Russia, and he has clamped down on pro-Russian media, pro-Russian media outlets, reduce the power of oligarchs in Russia and media oligarchs that support Russia. There's also, for instance, no autonomy granted to pro-Russian settlements and regions. This is rare, both amongst previous Ukrainian politicians, but also amongst other nations in similar positions, including most Eastern European states that don't take such a strong anti-Russian position. Note, therefore, that Zelensky's position is likely to be weakened when it's unclear what the benefit of this stance is likely to be and whether there's going to be a commensurate loyalty from the West in terms of supporting this position to begin with. The third thing I want to note, and this is the other reason why it's important, is because war fatigue amongst the Ukrainian military is extremely high. They've been fighting basically periods of hot war since 2013, and they are often already short of military resources. There have been a lot of domestic upheaval also in the Ukraine in the last 8 years that have contributed to this fatigue in the first place. This means that they're in an incredibly weakened position right now, and therefore more likely to be vulnerable to Russia. Conclusion, therefore, there is an immediate need to bolster the Ukraine to prevent all of the factors I'm talking about from resulting in a Russian incursion. The solution is therefore very simple. We do this policy, we commit to this model, and this allows for a couple of things. The first is that it allows for a NATO forward presence to exist in a far more legitimate way. Now, all might say they can afford NATO presence anyway, but the difference here is that there's a hesitation amongst NATO to push for a forward presence when they're doing it to a country that currently isn't a NATO member, insofar as it is seen as potentially NATO extending its territory, extending its boundaries to nations that aren't currently under its care. But second, it also means that there's immediate monetary benefit and aid and arms going to the Ukraine, because it is mandatory for all NATO members to support this process and support the Ukraine in defending against the Russian incursion. Therefore, I suggest to you that this is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. The first is Russia is currently in a position where they cannot afford drawn-out war. Why is this the case? three reasons. The first is they are weakened by sanctions that have occurred as a result of invading of Crimea. These sanctions have continued over the last couple of years. They have weakened their economic prospects in the first place. They're also weakened by the fact that in the oil crash in 2020 mean that a lot of the economic benefits that come from their export of oil did not occur in 2020, and they've lost a lot economically speaking. Putin's reputation, therefore, cannot take the risk of a drawn-out conflict with the Ukraine. Right now, Putin is looking for easy wins to distract from the domestic losses that he's currently experiencing, and therefore the invasion of the Ukraine is one way that he's trying to get this kind of easy win that can bolster his domestic position, but also act as a buffer against the West. What we do not want to do is allow him the ability to claim that easy victory, and insofar as it's likely to be a protracted, drawn-out conflict that doesn't lead to an immediate win for Russia, he's unlikely to be able to use it for political gain, and therefore he's less likely to want to commit to an incursion of the Ukraine. Before I move on, CEO.
So Russia annexed Crimea. It occupies an economically important region of Ukraine. You gave us a bunch of reasons why Russia cannot afford next war. What is the urgency exactly to join NATO in the first place?
The agency is everything that we already told you. There is already a current political will to potentially invade the Ukraine. This is going to be bad politically for the Ukraine, for NATO as a whole. I'm going to explain that a little bit later as well. Given all of this, I think posturing to support the Ukraine is critical to NATO for a couple of reasons. The first is NATO is currently at an inflection point. It needs to show its usefulness as a defensive and security pact insofar as it has not really demonstrated that usefulness in the last 20 years. NATO currently appears insufficient. And the problem here is that Eastern European countries' ability to be independent, nations like Belarus, for instance, or Slovenia, depends on their assurance that NATO works and NATO will defend them. Insofar as it is unclear whether this protection is likely to happen or will happen, it is not strategic for Eastern European nations to bandy against Russia or to adopt an independent position rather than a pro-Russian position, politically speaking. So, if the Ukraine falls and the NATO response is seen to be slow or ineffective, this means that there's likely to be a domino effect where other Eastern European nations, fearing their own sovereignty, fearing their own security, are likely to pander more towards Russia, which is necessarily bad for NATO. But more importantly, not just, and we already see it happening, for instance, in nations like Belarus, right? But more importantly, internationally, I think the fact is that countries believing in the ability for the West to protect them against belligerent actors like Russia and China is crucial in ensuring that they are independent actors and not beholden or proxies to these nations, to these big belligerent nations in the first place, and therefore the inability for NATO to protect what is currently viewed as an ally of NATO is going to be bad, insofar as we show you how we are able to protect Ukraine on our side. That's necessarily better. But also in the context of Russia, the Eastern Bloc expansion is also dangerous for NATO because it threatens nations like Poland, for instance, that are now suddenly sitting on the Eastern Bloc. So for EU countries in Central Europe, for instance, find themselves at the brunt of more security threats insofar as the Ukraine is exposed to a Russian incursion, which is necessarily bad for the EU and bad for NATO as a whole. For all these reasons, there is an incredible imperative to defend the Ukraine. The best way to do so is to admit them into NATO. That is why our side wins this debate.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech and invite the Leader of Opposition to continue the debate.
Someone's coming. Am I audible?
Yep.
Amazing. Cool. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's do this the Balkan win reality check the fuck out of this debate. Rebuttal is integrated. First of all, opening government has their causality wrong. The reason why Russia is deploying their troops around the Ukrainian border, which they haven't been doing apart from Donbass in the last 7 years, is because of the exact NATO shipments of arms to the Ukraine as part of the accession program that opening government is supporting. It's a red line for Russia that has been signaled before, and in fact, it's such a red line that the threat of attack is more credible than ever. We have leaked intel from the US and NATO that are already designated areas of attack, i.e. naval attacks to the ports of Odessa and Mariupol, incursions through Belarus. There's a literal military plan existing to invade Ukraine comparatively to the last 7 years because NATO is expanding, and the threat of NATO cannons being on the Russian border is exactly what is causing that mobilization. And Russia wouldn't mobilize otherwise as per OG's own analysis because they're relatively weak. Therefore, there needs to be a significant incentive for Russia Russia to choose to go into a military invasion, which OG says will happen despite their current weakness. This incentive only exists if you put tanks on their border and if they fear that also the internal legitimacy of the Putin regime is going to be delegitimized insofar as he's promised to defend the Russian borders and he's not doing it by responding to this. And we've seen this pattern before. In Ukraine itself, Crimea wasn't invaded because Russia cares about Crimea. Crimea was invaded because the European Union was about to accept Ukraine. Most Euro-Atlantic organizations don't accept members while they have a territorial dispute in their borders, particularly with an opponent of the Euro-Atlantic integration. They annexed Crimea to stop Ukraine from getting in. They did the same thing in Georgia in 2008, where they entered under the pretense of protecting Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The reason why they did this is to create a separatist state in northern Georgia, stopping Georgia from joining NATO, meaning that Russia reacts in situations where they fear that the sphere of influence of NATO is going to spread to their borders. This means, therefore, that given the internal political incentives, insofar as Putin has made a red line, and to stay credible, he has to honor the red line, but also to stay credible to his own people, this is the only situation where he is likely to react in terms of an invasion, as per OG's own analysis, that Russia currently cannot sustain a war. This is an impact, first of all, because people are going to die, and that's bad. But secondly, because insofar as OG says that Eastern European states are going to fear that NATO is not going to protect them, if NATO aggravates Russia to the extent that it invades an Eastern European country, I think that's when you want to pander to Russia, because otherwise Russia is going to invade you. Note also that government side doesn't have the fiat to say that expedition is going to happen tomorrow. Currently, Ukraine is decades away from joining Euro-Atlantic integration. NATO requires civic oversight over the military. They don't have it. They have military officials in the government. Secondly, the Pandora Papers have exposed a huge amount of corruption of the government of Petro Poroshenko. Insofar as NATO conditions require a democratic market government, this is unlikely to appease the allies. But thirdly, there is a Crimea. There is literally a territorial dispute. This means this, plus the fact that the expedition process still needs to go through NATO bureaucracy. It's maybe going to happen in 10 years instead of in 20, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. Because if NATO accepts Ukraine without Ukraine fulfilling certain minimal conditions, NATO loses legitimacy. There's already a situation where Western allies, particularly the US, feel that they're taking too much of the burden of the military spending. They are opposed to expansion insofar as they fear that countries like Ukraine are not going to take their share of the burden. This means that although the process is faster, Ukraine still needs to fulfill minimal conditions to get in. This means that the Russian reaction is necessarily going to be faster than our reaction. And the analysis coming from opening government as to why Russia cannot take a drawn-out war exactly proves that Russia is going to attack within the window in between the start of the expedition process and the end of the expedition process, because once they join NATO, Russia loses all of its geopolitical interest there. This means you just get a quick attack on Ukraine. On the Ukraine crisis resolution, opening government has got their facts wrong. Putin is currently acquiescing to the so-called Steinmeier plan, which sees independent elections in Donetsk and Luhansk as autonomous regions of Ukraine, because he knows he cannot outright annex the Donbass. What's important for Ukraine, I'm agnostic as to whether they're ever going to join Euro-Atlantic integration. What's important for Ukraine is to stop having a war within its borders and be able to develop economic stability. Putin is on the road to giving them that because he's turned to other things like fixing his economy and fixing COVID, as opening government concedes. But at the point where Ukraine becomes a hotbed for NATO activity, he's going to reverse the current peace efforts and attack fucking Ukraine, meaning you lose the same stability that you would want Ukraine to get otherwise. Here is why NATO is important. You only need NATO if somebody is going to attack you because of Article 5. Ukraine is only going to be attacked if it tries to join fucking NATO. I also don't know why joining NATO is good. Look, 2% of GDP is not a lot to spend on defense for the US. In Ukraine, 2% of GDP is fucking millions of dollars that could have been spent elsewhere because the GDP is relatively small, which is to say that the share of money they spend, I'm not even sure why joining NATO is a good thing. If you want them to join Euro-Atlantic integration, look, Putin is going to die at some point. They're only going to join in 20 years. It took 20 years for Croatia to join. Once Putin dies, there's likely to be a power vacuum within Russia. Nobody in United Russia has the charisma that he has. Is likely going to be some kind of pluralistic democracy that doesn't have the strength to push back against Ukraine. If you want them to join, you can join later. I also want to utilize opening government's own analysis as to why Russia is currently weak. Yes, it is. First of all, because of COVID. Secondly, because sanctions have reduced Russia's GDP, but also frozen assets of oligarchs, weakening Putin's power. Thirdly, oil is an inexhaustible resource, and countries like the USA have turned to fracking. Countries like the European Union have turned to renewable sources. Fourthly, is because China is shotgunning Russian allies via BRI in the Caucasus, which means they're turning to China instead of Russia. This means that the West can demand concessions from Russia in the status quo. Firstly, they can demand things like human rights concessions, as we're doing in the Donbass with the Steinmeier plan. Secondly, we got get Russian cooperation on crises like Syria, where we get Russian military support from the air, crisis we would not have solved otherwise. Thirdly, we get Russian negotiation with actors that would not negotiate with the West because their governments feel it's illegitimate because the West attacked them before. Things like Iran. Russia was key to brokering the Iran deal. The key is we can get concessions from Russia because it's weak and it wants us to remove sanctions. But once we put NATO cannons on its border, the incentive shifts because the internal legitimacy of the government is based on protecting the Russian people, and its credibility is based on honoring the red line outwardly, which means we lose the ability to get those concessions which would have otherwise gotten because we change Russian fucking incentives. We can get Russia for useful things. We can no longer get for useful things on their side of the house. We have already won. Closing government now. Opening government. Amazing. We've won. Cool.
Look,
yeah, go.
This makes literally no sense. All of these analysis you say comes after a war in which we have already committed to being an ally of Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. What is the tipping point?
The tipping point is that the one thing is to say that Ukraine has political connections to the West. The other is when the US is shipping patrol boats and anti-tank missiles into the Ukraine as part of the accession process, which is literally what your prime minister supports. And this is the delta you committed to supporting in this debate. You have to stand behind this. And this is why we've already lost. Lastly, this makes it worse for other countries. Not that Russia is turning inwardly because of COVID, because of solving its economic crisis. But when Russia fears that NATO is going to again try to use the opportunity to get countries around Russia into its fold, it means they're going to try to stop the return of Mikhail Saakashvili and the removal of the corrupt government in Georgia. It means you're going to act against the mass popular movement against Lukashenko that was created after he closed down opposition leaders like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, things like that. Countries around Russia are liberalizing, but Russia is going to crack down on it if it feels that these countries are going to become NATO hotbeds. It becomes worse for the countries around Russia as well. For all of these reasons, opening opposition already wins this debate.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for that speech and remind speakers that in online era to have some sort of discretion to account for differences in connection speed, lag, whatnot. If a speaker has requested to receive a POI prior to it being offered and it then being offered after the fact, this is generally something that is acceptable. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue.
Right, Jason, can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Cool, thanks. Sorry, no, my table is like, I'm not sorry to you. Yeah, I guess this works. I know. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Hanno, the central push for opening government is that NATO and Eastern Europe in general is an inflection point at which its legitimacy is questioned, and therefore it has all the more necessity in order to prove its efficacy on our side of the house. That is why we propose. I've tried many times to claim that Tin is being assertive and never has it worked. So I'm going to rebut him point by point, explain why I think we are genuinely leading in this debate. First, this bizarre argument that we are really good at cooperating with Russia. I already pointed out in POI to no real response that this is factually untrue because we have a long history of resisting Russia. At the point when Russia was working with us on Iran, we were also being aggressive against them on the Nord Stream issue. The reason for that is that countries can have multiple different considerations at a particular point in time. Russia can see value in cooperating with the West on some issues while also resisting the West on other issues and being unhappy on other issues as well. The difference is at a point when this goes overboard and you therefore need to actually react. I.e., military things happen, which can happen in the status quo at a point when Russia attacks Ukraine and possibly the West feels the need to intervene. Those flashpoints are when you lose the ability to cooperate. That absolutely flips the argument that Tin is making. Let's ask the core question then. Who protects Ukraine and therefore protects the rest of NATO? The first thing I need to do with this anti-reality argument is purely because of arms existing in Ukraine. That is why Russia starts to be aggressive towards Ukraine. This is just untrue. First, it's unclear why in 2014 they would have stopped at Donbass without going forward, when all possibility exists in the status quo within Ukraine, which means that there is always an incentive for Russia to continue being expansionist within Ukraine anyway. Secondly, note that it is untrue that NATO would have just picked the fight with Russia by throwing arms within the Ukraine. And the reason for that is at a time in Trump era, for example, when they were aggressive, when US was aggressive against other nations on the 2% thing, there was no incentive to get into more trouble than necessary. Yet they did that, which suggests to me that NATO viewed a consistent threat coming out of Russia. even if you don't believe this ignores structural analysis from Dion on two things. One, the fact that before 2013, there was no apparent logic or like aggression against Russia that motivated the attack into Donbass, which suggests that this threat is constant. But second, and more importantly, the internal political narrative, the situation within Russia. Dion told you that the incentive to attack always exists because Putin needs nationalism as a response. They say two things. The first thing they say is Putin will die in future. Yes, but that creates more of an incentive to assert yourself now and create stronger and stronger narratives around the United Russia Party, which requires the nationalism to exist now while Putin is a strong man in power. Second, this idea that they say that they're fixing COVID and the economy. Are you kidding me? The reality that in the round 4, like energy prices rise, they might fall next time. That's entirely uncertain that this is a definite win that they can get. But second, the reality that COVID is like this, all these benefits are incredibly uncertain. See the new variant and whatnot, right? Which suggests to me that this is an uncertain thing for them to stake on. In contrast, the certainty that you get out of a status quo where Ukraine is weak, and you get easy military victories and therefore easy nationalist pride is one that is incredibly tempting the status quo. That means that it's likely, without doing anything, that they are going to attack. More than that, note also the fact that they have proven themselves completely unable to control Navalny at a point when his movement is getting more and more tactical voting out, even with repression and even with Navalny in jail, suggests to me that it is highly likely that this threat is going to be perceived. If not now, in the future, it might do so. And that is why it's better to ensure that we quickly ensure that we have Ukraine under protection, especially given the comparative that Tin admits is 40 years. That 40 years, how many times they can go and invade Ukraine? How many times they go and threaten Ukraine? That kind of risk is evidently not worth taking. Finally and importantly, note that Ukraine is already a strong ally given the actions that have been taken in the past. We can't reverse giving them arms. So all we can do is ensure that insofar as a risk to Ukraine exists, we give them the definite support that comes from being a NATO member that therefore ensures the position of NATO. They say here that Ukraine doesn't want to join. This is silly because obviously if they, we can't force them to join, right? This evidently means that they want to join. They then said Russia cannot sustain a war, so there's not going to be a war on our side. This ignores that competing issues exist from Russia, right? If you can get an easy win, that's something you want to do because a swift and decisive victory is very, very different from a long drawn-out war. So they will enter if they have a swift and decisive victory. They won't if there's high mutually assured destruction. That's just intuitive. But I don't understand what this rebuttal. Then they say Ukraine is a bad actor, to enter. First, I think there's a fiat to do this fast, so I don't understand this 40-year thing. But more pertinently, note that the legitimacy of NATO doesn't actually rest on whether or not you are in a position to be particularly nice to Ukraine, or be in a position to have Ukraine as a particularly nice actor. See, for example, the EU deciding to keep Poland and Hungary. See the actors that US has backed, like Saudi Arabia, which suggests that all of these other things like corruption, they are there for sure. But the reality is that what you want is security. And the reason for that is from the point of view of countries within NATO, security, stopping the advance of Russia through Eastern Europe is an existential threat that takes precedence over your moral determinants of right and wrong and what you would prefer and not prefer, because of the importance of this existential threat. But more than that, I posit that if we announce this, we will therefore commit to a faster action. So even if it's true that we can't do it overnight, we will therefore commit to more action than we otherwise would, which therefore ensures that we protect the Ukraine. They finally say the US is going to hate NATO. Look, the reality is that US will agree to this, right? Because NATO can't move without the United States anyway. Note also the hugely significant support on all sides of the house. Dion's analysis for why we need to support these countries, because if not, they have a tendency to tilt towards Russia, is incredibly important. In fact, all of Tin's analysis does nothing to rebut Dion, because what Dion tells you is that, sure, maybe it's because Ukraine entered, but doing nothing doesn't remove the troops that already exist on the border. In that world, in a world where you already feel this threat because of previous actions like enhanced forward presence that apparently created the Russian threat, the solution is to go in more in order to ensure their security rather than to do nothing and hope for goodwill on the part of Russia that they're not going to attack. But let me tell you the absolute worst case scenario. What if Russia really attacks as a result of this? There are a few things to note. The first is that I think there is value to immediately resisting Russia anyway. And the reason for that is twofold. First, a combined force of NATO is likely to get more out of Russia in a war than Russia's ability to get from NATO. The implication of this, and this is important, is that in a war of attrition globally, in a war where Russia has a weak economy, in this worst case scenario, we are able to cripple Russia to the point that we resolve them as an actor in many other situations, which means that we then are able to consolidate in Ukraine and therefore win this war. If the risk of war is inevitable on both sides of the house, we at least control Russia for all other Eastern European nations. We at least ensure that NATO looks like a legitimate actor. That means that people are more likely to buy into this. But second and more importantly, the comparative is dealing with a consistently potentially rogue Russia. The difference, for example, is like looking at the 70s or the Cold War when we were constantly still Russia versus the 90s when we were able to actually care about things like human rights, actually place pressure on people to be less corrupt. That only happens when you can first be sure of your security situation, and that exclusively happens at the point that we get this decisive victory over Russia. Absolute worst case scenario. Maybe we lose, but if we lose and if NATO is good, like first this would require NATO to be as half-fucked as OO says. But in that world, I posit that maybe that's better. Maybe it's better that we review NATO to be an empty vessel, because in that world, countries make better choices than a world where they suddenly get attacked and then don't get the defense that NATO has. Look, countries on both sides of the house are likely going to get some form of like assistance from NATO in the small minimal forms that existed in Ukraine. If Tin is correct, that this is what caused the war, caused like tension, that tension might happen anyway, and so we absolutely need to protect against it. That is why we win.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Please offer POIs. If some haven't been offered, ideally ask if anyone's got any. Sweet. DLO whenever you're ready.
Okay, I assume I can be heard. It's the same microphone that Tin used, so I'm guessing it shouldn't be a problem. That is good. I love being correct. It's one of my favorite things. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Let's reiterate the last point that Tin has brought in his speech, because that's a point that was left virtually unresponded to, and I think it's strong enough on itself to win as a debate, even if you don't believe the other things, and we've also shown you other things, but we'll get on later. On countries around Russia, there is currently a liberalizing wing. Saakashvili is back in Georgia and likely to take power against the current anti-democratic government. There is a mass popular movement in Belarus against Lukashenko after he imprisoned opposition leaders such as Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Russia doesn't see this as a priority right now. They explicitly abandoned Belarus in the migrant crisis because they turned inwardly to reduce the harms of COVID and to fix their economy, which is currently in shambles. This means that there is a current window for liberalization on countries around Russia. But if NATO signals renewed activity in Eastern Europe, Russia has a priority switch, because Russia now has to fear that these countries will become NATO hotbeds and has to react against this. The only thing worse for Russia than having NATO somewhere on your border is having NATO on multiple spots on your border. So Russia has a clear incentive, regardless of how this plays out in Ukraine, to act more anti-democratically and more aggressively within other countries against its border to ensure that NATO does not have a foothold anywhere else around Russia. Furthermore, yes, energy prices may be rising, but A, this is a temporary inflation of an exhaustible resource, and B, this doesn't change the fact that sanctions have crippled Russian trade, and Russia's weakness has led to China drawing Russian economic allies such as Kazakhstan and Armenia away from Russia because it outspended Russia through the BRI. Additionally, OG cannot simultaneously say that A, Russia is very weak and it cannot take an all-out war, and rebut us by saying, oh, they're strong because of rising energy prices. They need to decide what they're actually going to run. And lastly, commitment on more action in Eastern Europe does not inherently mean that we have to protect these states. It just means that Russia reacts to prevent from assimilating them, right? Especially if it's weak and it wants to do so before these other countries would have an incentive and an ability to join NATO and Euro-Atlantic integration, right? We've literally seen it happen before with Crimea and Georgia. It's unclear, and OG never show why this is going to be different on their side. Before I move on, I'll take a point from closing.
Sure. Don't you think that the fact that Russia is weak right now when it comes to, for example, the coming presidential election means that now is the best time to shore up NATO defenses before it regains the type of advantage that would make us less effective at doing so in the future?
Let's talk about that, because this is explicitly said in Tin's speech. Considering that Russia is weak now does not mean that Russia cannot try to go out for a war, and does not mean that civilian casualties are going to be something that is happening. Note that even if they say, oh, Russia is weak, does not mean that Russia is going to be losing a war. And even if it does, it doesn't mean it's going to be different on their side of the house. The point here is what is Russia's current needs and wants in the current state. Because Russia is weak, because Russia has different priorities, they're not extremely caring of what does have of what is the current situation within Ukraine, as long as it remains.
Oh, sorry, Peter, the audio's gone.
Yes.
Back now.
Okay, cool.
Stopped you like 7 seconds ago at 3 minutes. You just finished responding to the POI.
Okay, sorry, I pressed the button. Okay, continuing on. meaning that as long as the status quo remains what it is in Ukraine, Russia has shown that it does not have an incentive to currently act. And Tin has told you that OG have their facts backwards, meaning that the current arms in Russia that they frame are the current Russian armed forces on the Ukraine border are not here because Russia suddenly made a personality change, are there because NATO is currently sending arms within Ukraine because of the accession process, right? By OG's metrics, Russia wouldn't mobilize otherwise because they own their own framing that they are currently weak. But the difference that they make here, when they're significantly expediting the approval process for Ukraine's NATO membership, means that that Putin has to change change the narrative that he's pushing, because now the calculus falls on the side of invasion when NATO guns are guaranteed to be in Ukraine, because Russia reacts for fear of NATO, and Putin has to do this to stay credible because this is one of his primary ascension points to the power that he has. Moving on, when they want to claim, oh, there is no war on side government. Cool. Note the nuance that OG misses, which is extremely frustrating. One, they agreed that we can't put Ukraine in NATO overnight. Two, they also frame that Russian troops are on the border right now. Three, Tin notes that we have leaked military plans that are already made by the Russian government, meaning that the Russian government currently, because of the arms that are already in Ukraine, have an incentive to do something and are ready to take action. This means that OG implicitly concede that Russia has time to attack before we have time to put Ukraine within NATO, because they also concede this is not happening overnight, because Ukraine has to meet certain conditions. Consider then that Tin also give you incentives why Russia is more likely to attack when they are forced to change their priorities. Meaning, when a threat of NATO borders touching Russian borders and NATO cannons on the Russian-Ukraine border is a larger threat than fixing the economy that is currently focused on. Tin shows you, and OG agrees, that why Russia is weak. This means that Russia currently has a priority to fix its weakness, but this priority is lessened by the fact that NATO cannons could be on the border if the Ukraine-NATO process is going to be expedited. This means that to stop this, Russia has a clear incentive to invade within territories of Ukraine, meaning that this would halt the process and make it even longer than on side op if it's ever going to happen, right? Because there are certain conditions you have to meet for joining NATO. If CG wants to go ahead and say, oh, we'll just throw all the conditions out the window, Tin has also told you that NATO does not want to lose legitimacy currently, that NATO also does not want to take more burden because NATO members are already feeling like they took enough of they're taking more of a burden to defend countries like Ukraine, countries that are not going to be able to give their fair share in the NATO protection, right? This also emphasizes the point that NATO is going to be slower than Russia because it needs to show progress within these metrics. Furthermore, on the points of counterfactual concessions, which were not touched upon by OG because Tin just has more spec knowledge than the rest of the world combined, currently the Ukraine wants to stop the wars within his border. Putin is on the road to care less about Ukraine than he does about fixing Russia. We show you why the calculus has changed. Furthermore, on the concession that we can demand, right? The Russian help and negotiations with countries like Iran, which Tin has talked about, are things that we can demand currently in Russia. It's unclear why OG say Russia can play both sides, because they're unlikely to have an incentive to do so. So one of Putin's primarily political agendas is the unification of Russia and protecting Russia's border sovereignty. Therefore, fear of the West is implicit in this, right? Once we have NATO cannons in Ukraine, we lose the ability to get these concessions. And lastly, on what is better for Ukraine, Tin has told it we're agnostic why Ukraine and NATO is good, that you only need NATO to not get attacked. Because of the OG frame, where Russia is unlikely to attack without NATO intervention, because we have shown this. We have shown you that the expedited ascension to NATO is not something that Ukraine needs. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech, and indeed everybody for what was a brilliant top half member of government. Whenever you're ready.
Hi, you able to hear me okay?
Yep, all good.
I think this debate has been a hot mess, probably reminds you of the Oxford quarterfinals from last year about Ethiopia. And I think that's in large part due to Tin pretty much lying for the first 3 minutes of his LO. As someone whose dad is in the US Navy, who's literally been to Crimea, who's been stationed on the Black Sea, let me clarify a little bit about what the actual situation is and why it's not probably conceived in a way that is so perfectly strategically advantageous to Tin, which as a gut check probably seems like it'll make sense. I think the first thing is that the analysis that comes out of LO about the ways in which NATO weaponry is set in this red line that as soon as it's crossed creates this specific incentive for Russia to invade, or rather like constrains their choice so that they ought invade, or they feel like they have to invade. Couple of problems with this. The first is that the DLO knifes Tin in the back by conceding that the strategic interests in this area are so great that Russia is going to be heavily invested and interested either way. Secondarily, it's just an outright lie. Gut check. Why would NATO give weapons to states that it, as per Tin's analysis, potentially views to be corrupt when it's concerned about its own legitimacy, when it's concerned about being able to sustain itself with funding? I think that support probably looks a lot more like military joint training exercises, looks a lot like the requirements I'm going to tell you later in this speech that Ukraine is filling, not just handing them magical weaponry, especially if it would be a red line, as Tin says. I think the third thing is that it's also not a specific red line, because even if we are giving them weapons, it's not a unique delta. Why? Because you have heavy US military presence in the area, both in Ukraine and in the Black Sea, which borders it directly to the south. Why do we have such heavy international, but specifically US military presence in the area? Because the Black Sea is fucking strategic in 3 important ways. One, because it's literally right next to Ukraine, so the next time that Russia invades, you will have troops who are immediately nearby in order to be able to respond. Secondarily, because it's a strategic vantage point to be able to transit quickly, both for Central Asia to access Eastern Europe, but also Russia to be able to then access it to then access like southern Eastern Europe, whatever you call Turkey, in that area as well. But the third is that it's also a massive economic, importantly, region, because all of these military advantages double apply as economic advantages. And this is the quickest trade route between Central Asia and Eastern Europe, for example, that directly connects Georgia to Romania, for example, then allows them to trade and flow things from the entirety of Central Asia quickly into this region through the protected route that the US currently folds, which is why they're willing to put their economic trade routes on that line, because the US promises it will stay there, which means that military presence is pretty symmetric. This doesn't make a big delta for Russia. But then the fourth is that then Tin says, but if we didn't cross this line, Russia wouldn't do anything because it's weak. The problem is that it doesn't engage with the status quo, where Russia is doing a variety of pernicious things, ranging from disinformation campaigns in the Ukraine to targeted assassinations to drone flyovers, which is basically a form of gray zone warfare in order to keep Ukraine perpetually on the offensive, perpetually ready to fight, which is extraordinarily expensive and creates an existential looming threat for the populace of Ukraine, which stokes and foments far-right anti-sentiments that are criticizing the current government for trying to join NATO, when from their perspective, NATO isn't doing jack shit about it, and Russia's flying drones literally over our homes, which means the longer we wait, the longer these tactics work, tactics notably that are not very expensive, and Russia can easily do while weak, meaning Tin bites the bullet on all of these harms without explaining why they would get lessened. I think the one attempt Tim does make is, Russia's weak, therefore we can get magical concessions out of them. I would, one, point out that I think that Russia has a stranglehold on Europe because of the energy crisis. This is different from OG simply saying the energy crisis exists, so we can't attack Russia. I would argue that because the energy crisis exists, we are more reliant on things like the Nord Stream, for example, which means the largest actors in Europe, like Germany, are particularly unable to pivot against Russia right now because they've invested so much into changing where they're sourcing their gas from in order to make themselves more Russia dependent. Why they did that, I don't know. Probably should have listened to the US, but it's bad for OO in this case. But the second thing that I would say is that if concessions worked the way that Tim wanted them to, we probably would have used them to, I don't know, convince Russia to stop manipulating and instrumentalizing Belarus to commit literal migrant warfare on the rest of Eastern Europe. If we had that type of concessionary power, I think we probably would have used it, given that Tin couldn't point out anything in the reality that we have been using it for probably doesn't exist. But then I would think 2 further responses about why it is that Russia is particularly unlikely to act militarily in the way that they want, but will continue to act in these sub-military options that I just characterized for you, are as such. One, as I flagged in the POI, there's an upcoming presidential election, which makes Putin particularly vulnerable because he's trying to restructure the current Russian democratic governance in order to be able to keep his own power as premier while trading over power militarily to another actor in his place. That makes it a particularly poor time to start military conflict that is prolonged and protracted, because he will then have to transition power, which he's publicly promised to do, in the middle of this conflict, which one makes the entire entire process more volatile. But two, that means he's trading over the security future of Russia to someone in the middle of a literal war. I think the secondary thing is that his patronage system is interested in the Nord Stream deal, for example. So even if Europe was able to backlash and respond on that, they are particularly likely to pressure him not to do this because they have a fuck ton of money invested in the decade-long process that it's taken to create Nord Stream, and they don't want to see that money drain down the thing. I think the third thing is that CO flagged this in a POI, which kind of knifes their OO a little bit, that if they've already garnered the most economically prosperous portion of Ukraine, i.e. Crimea, there's far less practical incentive for Russia to be able to do so with further invasion. I think then the last thing that I want to point out, and this is the last primary extension that you'll get from us, is why Tin has completely lied about what Ukraine has done and how ready they are to join NATO. But before I do that, does Tin have a response?
Apart from the fact that you can fucking Google US patrol boat shipments to Ukraine, if the CG is right about the US having a huge military presence in the Black Sea, which is presumably a deterrent to Russia, why the fuck do you need them joining NATO? CG conveniently decides not to have a comparative case. Thank you, closing government.
I wouldn't need to Google it because I gave analysis. Unfortunately, your asserted fact claims have already been responded by OG and CG, which is why you will fall out and we won't. The second thing is that my case will now show why it is that you do have a delta in terms of how it changed internal Ukraine political perception. Contrary to what OO has said, Ukraine has been trying to join NATO for more than 13 years. What this means is that they have done a couple of important things. One, they have demonstrated through things like joining the distinctive partnership program with NATO that has certain types of economic liberalization trade-offs that they are willing in order to be able to join. Secondary, they literally renounced their non-aligned Russian state status, which hugely pissed off Russia and put them at risk of all the things that Russia is doing right now on the basis that NATO promised them that this would be a path towards accession. Thirdly, they've engaged in joint military exercises with NATO without receiving reprimand, as I told you, which makes them more at risk but less able to defend themselves. Fifthly, they've made huge foreign policy promises publicly, which both affects their own political legitimacy domestically, but also trades off the foreign policy decisions they're making exogenously over trying to create conditions that allow them to join NATO as much as possible. Fifth, as Tin helpfully conceded for me, they joined the pre-approval process for NATO, which is where you are required to release, for example, financial documents, which is where you are required to, for example, democratize your inner industry away from military leadership, which is why they aren't engaged in the types of things that Tin then said they're engaged in. Seventh, they have huge campaign promises with their public, all of which wins every single thing in this round because it, one, shows why they are really trying to join. Two, it shows why they have the political will to withstand the 2% budget that Tin is concerned about. Three, it means that NATO won't lose legitimacy because Ukraine has done everything it asked. But fourth and most importantly, we have a duty to intervene because Ukraine is as vulnerable as it is precisely because they did things and made themselves weaker on our promise that we would protect them, and then we didn't move in, which is where you see more internal turning away from NATO and critique of this progressivism and critique of these types of political changes, which means you're likely to see more backsliding, Ukraine become even more vulnerable, all of which is our fault to begin with, and all of which will be worse if we don't move into Ukraine, even if the Black Sea is symmetric. Sorry, Tin.
I'd like to thank the member of government for that speech and ask that the recording be stopped so that the member of opposition's speech may begin.
Am I audible?
Yeah, just if you want to wait until the live stream stopped before you begin speaking.
Sounds good.
I'm still getting the live on YouTube flashing up at the top. Is Org here? Let me go to the Discord.
Sorry, I'm here. Just going to stop my Discord.